Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode today. As always, I'm Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. Our communication is what creates our social world, so it's worth being intentional about how we choose to communicate. If it's our communication that creates our social worlds, then we can kind of work backwards. Think about what kind of social world we want to live in, and then go backwards from there and say, okay, what choices do we need to be making to achieve that? Today we are starting our conversation with Ilene Wasserman and Jeff Branch. Ilene and Jeff work together at ICW Consulting. They're a part of a number of other things. Ilene is also one of the board members for the CMM Institute, which is how I was first able to interact with her. She's been a great help on this podcast and a mentor to me, and so I'm glad to be able to bring this conversation to all of you. You can read more about them in the description. I'll include more information there, and they'll also have pages on the Stories Lived, Stories Told website where you can learn more about the other work that they do. Some questions that I would have you keep in mind as you enter into this conversation with us are: where do you find community? What does community look like for you? What does community do for you? And how are you intentional about sparking community? So with those questions in mind, and without further ado, let's get started.
Hi, Jeff and Ilene. Thanks so much for being here today to talk to me.
Hi, Abby. It's so great to be with you.
Hi, Abby. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
I'm really looking forward to it. I think this is going to be, I think all my conversations are meaningful, but I'm especially excited to see what meaning emerges out of this conversation for us and for the people listening. I would love to just jump in and ask you both to introduce yourselves a little bit. And of course, I ask you to introduce yourselves by storytelling and telling us some stories that can help give us context about who you are, what the work that you do is, and other things that you feel is important to know about you for this conversation. Ilene, can I ask you to go first?
Oh, sure. Thank you so much, Abby. It's a joy to join your amazing podcast. We're big fans of your podcast. Jeff and I work together in ICW Consulting Group, where we are the leads of a team of about 8 consultants, depending on the season. And Jeff and I have been working together for going on 15 years. And I'll start out with a little bit about my background and what inspired me to do the work that I do, which I have to say, I wake up in the morning and I feel so privileged to do the work I do. And I'll speak to that as we talk. So a little bit about my background. And I grew up in a family that was in the New York area, and it was in the wake of World War II. So my father fought in World War II. My grandparents were immigrants escaping atrocities and pogroms in Eastern Europe. And so I grew up with the stories of my identity as somebody who was in the United States, benefiting from freedom, being Jewish, front and center. And so that really shaped a lot of my early stories and early patterns of seeing things. Because in retrospect, I see that I grew up with a group identity. And that group identity was connected with some other identities, fearful of some other identities. I had trigger reactions to certain accents. And I realized from a very early age that that shaped me. And I went to a summer camp just by chance. My next door neighbor was going to that summer camp. And so I said, can I go? And this summer camp was focused on group process and social justice. It happened to be developed by social work professors who wrote a grant for this summer camp. And so we looked at things. If somebody did something wrong, we sat down in a circle and looked at our collective responsibility. That was my earliest socialization around groups. And so groups and group process, I don't know if I would have been there from the get-go if I hadn't gone to this camp, but it was in my blood. And so when I was in college, I participated in and ended up leading a peer coaching, peer counseling organization. And that organization trained counselors and trained trainers to teach communication skills, listening skills, the basic car-cough, creating a helping relationship skills. And I loved it. I loved it because we were creating emissaries that went out into the campus and were good listeners and good friends and present to other people in caring and loving ways. And so I had a professor who was very much a mentor to me. And when I talked to him about what to do after college, he said, "You love this. Why don't you just do this?" And when I look back on it, everything that I have done since is a blossoming of that work. One of the things about the way I work and the way Jeff and I work is that we work with people interpersonally, we work with groups, and we work with whole systems. And this organization that I worked with in college did just that. The camp I went to did just that. These were pivotal moments that I feel so blessed to have experienced as I was growing and developing. And the one thing I will add to that is how diversity became so important to me and at the core of everything I do. And I say diversity and social justice in the same sentence. Early in my life, it took a lot for me to have exposure to differences because I grew up in a town that was primarily white, Jewish, and Catholic. And somewhere along the lines, I learned that people who were Jewish and Catholic were the minority. And it was when I went to college that I learned about different cultures, had friends of different cultures. And at the same time, when I went to college, which was at Cornell University, there was a lot of racial tension on campus. And so for me to grow and develop relationships across race, we had to do it in secret. Not so much for me, but because there was a lot of peer pressure on my friends to limit how the nature of their interactions and friendships with people from other groups. And so I learned a lot from those days. And then there was some intentionality about bringing more diversity to the organization that I was leading in college. So those were all early seeds that blossomed when I started doing consulting in the healthcare industry. And I was consulting primarily to an underserved population. And our clients said to us, "How can you understand us? You haven't lived in our world." And these were leaders who were Black, leaders who were Latino and Asian. And that was my opening to recognize that I wanted to learn about not just them and their cultures and their stories, but I needed to look at what it meant to be white in a new way, because I was now looking at myself through the lenses of others and learning about what that meant and what it meant for being responsible in a relationship, responsible for being curious, responsible for looking at patterns and turns and how we could do those better.
All right, Jeff, tell us about you.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. And you know what? I just learned a little bit more about Ilene.
Excellent.
For sure. That was great. One of the things I was thinking about, because my mind really hones in on episodes. So I was thinking about one of the biggest things that was most important to me as a young kid was I was always very curious. And I'm talking about curious. And I can remember probably as early as the age of 5 or 6. And one of my greatest pleasures was to go into the park, into nature. And one of the things that was most interesting to me, and I paid attention to this, was in Philadelphia, that the way Philadelphia is situated or constructed, the park is in the middle of a whole bunch of different neighborhoods. So it serves as like the boundaries in a lot of different neighborhoods. So certainly West Philly, North Philly, Northwest Philly, South Philly. And one of the things I noticed was that people looked different in each one of those neighborhoods. So I knew in the neighborhood I grew up in, it was majority of Black people. And then some of the other neighborhoods seemed to be integrated with Black and white people. And then some neighborhoods were white people, Italian, might have been Irish. But I was always very curious. And then when we would go to different parts of the park, probably with my parents feeling safe to go to different parts, I would always try to engage with all the other kids. Mm-hmm. And I just felt like I had some great relationships there. But that kind of centered me somewhat. And I was thinking through, I want to learn about people. I want to learn about difference. I want to learn about how we're common at that age. And can you have it? I have a whole bunch of uncles, and I would ask a lot of questions, and they would say, Jeff, it's not that deep. And I would say, yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yeah. And part of it also was that I was growing up with a lot of trauma in my household. My mom was a paranoid schizophrenic. And it was a really challenging time. I'm the oldest of 3. And when I say that I looked at episodes, I was always very attentive where there was a possibility where things would go awry.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things that occurred when, I was thinking about my mom, who was a brilliant person, when she would go through episodes, she would go mute with me and my younger brother, my younger sister. So we wouldn't hear her voice. Right. The only way she would communicate with us was by writing notes. And this could be up to a year where the only type of communication that we had was through a note. And I remember as a kid saying, I just want to hear her voice. And that actually got me in tune, though, to be able to write and listen to what people are saying in the writing itself. And then if I thought about another episode right at that same time when she was committed to a mental institution, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And I was one of the first kids to be bused for integration purposes. So I was bused from West Philly to South Philly. And I knew, and I could pay attention to the anxiety my mom was feeling and also my dad was feeling. But I was feeling excited that I could meet new people at the same time. So I had great experiences, started building great relationships. But that morning after Martin Luther King was assassinated, we had school that day. And I get off the school bus and the Black kids and the white kids are fighting in the schoolyard. And I run off the bus and I'm along with the teachers. I'm trying to break up the fights that are happening in the schoolyard. And it was really intense. Here we are thinking about that, 11, 12 years old. And, as I reflected on it a little bit, I knew we were responding to our parents' anger, remorse, all of that. But I'm breaking up the fights. And then all of a sudden, it hits me that people must think that we're different. And that look that I had on my face, I remember one of my teachers coming up and wrapping his arms around me and saying, Jeff, everything will be okay.
Oh.
Everything will be okay. But it sat with me and in my heart, in my spirit, just like Eileen, when I'm thinking about some of the commonalities, I recognized that I had to do something different. And this is still in the midst of my mom's going through episodes. She's not committed at this time, but I'm there, I'm listening to her cry, everything else, her hopes, all of that. And I remember telling her, I have to do something. And there was a Jewish school, a Jewish group that was meeting at the School for the Blind in the Overbrook section. And they were meeting on Saturdays. And I said, I got to do this. I have to do this. So there were Jewish kids and Black kids like myself, and we were learning about social justice. How do we engage? How do we make a difference in the world? And I was doing that every week. The funny side of that was like my grandmother was living with us, and she was so adamant about that the kids should be doing chores on Saturday. And my mom, even through all her trouble, said, no, he's going to do this every Saturday. He's going to do this. And I could see the tension between both of them.
Yeah.
Because my grandmother probably didn't understand what my mom understood, even in her challenges. That left me in that space. I remember being 11, 12, 13, really trying to think through and still hearing my uncle say, it's not that deep. And I'm saying, yes, it is that deep. Asking questions and then trying to help people really be intentional around getting their voice in. And I knew it was connected with my mom not talking. Here, this brilliant woman with a lot to say, a lot to offer, and she elected not to have her voice activated. So it was the precursor to actually being in leadership a lot, and certainly learning skills with the Jewish group that brought us together around trying to create spaces where people could exercise their voice and understand their power, the power that they had at the same time. So that's been like a big part of my practice. That's been a big part of our practice. And then now I hear a little bit more nuggets around why we connected, even a little bit more around that belief. And I've been able to share that story. I used to be embarrassed by the story about my mom, but I recognized when I was doing OD, organization development work internally, when I was designing what was supposed to be transformative learning, that I had to model disclosure and transparency to promote the multiple levels of system that Eileen talked about around individual discovery, group connection, the opportunity to transform systems and community, and designing those spaces where people would feel safe enough, and not just safe enough, but brave enough to share their stories in those spaces there.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you both for sharing all that you did, and feel that I know both of you better now, and I appreciate that. And you make me think of my own story, and it's really great to hear that both of you were able to start, at least practicing having conversations about social justice and saying, what does this look like and what's my role in it, seemingly pretty early on. For me, my story probably looked more like Eileen, where I wasn't able to start engaging in relationships with people whose experiences were different than mine until more like college. And another, thing that goes hand in hand absolutely with that, which was making me think about when Jeff was talking, was that my family is one that I would say was very much guided by like taboo. Like there was a lot of things we just didn't talk about. And so we were not a story sharing kind of family in that way. We didn't kind of lean into those more difficult conversations. We shied away from them. That's what I was kind of taught. And so for me, the past couple of years, learning about CMM, doing this podcast, going to school and studying communication has been about unpacking all of those things and starting to put myself into these conversations that really require you to do some of that self-reflection and then leaning into these more challenging moments. But for me, through the podcast and everything, I've just really come to believe that the stories that we find maybe more challenging to tell because we've been told we should feel shame or embarrassment or something about them are almost always the ones that we should be most telling, or it's the ones that we like want to hear from others the most, but they're really hard to tell for ourselves. But I just think those are really powerful. Those kinds of stories are the most powerful. And I'm sure you've encountered that in your work in your lives too. And so I appreciate you both sharing the stories that you have and being authentic and letting us get to know you better over this hour of a podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, I was thinking I shared this story with Ilene. And one of the things that was what I really appreciate about her was probably one of our first experiences together. We had the opportunity to design an international meeting on trauma-informed care and resiliency. And she was so attentive because a lot of these stories, as you described, the patterns, all of those things were emerging in that experience. And what we recognized as we were doing the experience was the design was much for us as it was for the clients. And her staying connected. And I think that's a big part of our connection too, was really valuable for me at that point in time.
Perfect segue, because the next thing I was wanting to ask about is to know more about your relationship, the two of you, and if you could tell me kind of the story of how it came to be that you formed ICW and have been working together for, did you say 15 years now?
Yeah. So this is one of those things like when you have a great partner, right? There's always, there's my story and it could be her story. So one of the things, we have a great community of people, and I think it was a lot of people because of our practice the years before we met. They kept saying, you need to meet Ilene Wasserman. And we would be on a lot of proposals together, RFPs together, but we never actually had the opportunity to meet each other initially. And for, a couple of the projects or a few of the projects, didn't go through for whatever reason. But we met at a social event that was related to our network. It's called the Philadelphia Region OD Network. And we finally met each other. And we probably stayed connected at that event the whole time. I said, Ilene, people keep saying that we needed to meet each other. And we talked and we talked. And from that point on, we've been connected at the hip in a lot of different ways. And I understood why people said, you and Ilene need to meet each other, for sure. And a lot of it, I think a lot of reasons why we didn't meet each other at that point. One, because I believe in the universe. We weren't meant to meet each other up until that point. But when we did, it was that seed of connection that just continued to blossom and blossom.
Yeah.
Is that the way you remember it, Ilene?
Mostly. What's interesting is the moment that stays with me is having coffee after that meeting. And it was just 2 hours felt like 5 minutes. And we just said, we really want to work together. We just really want to work together. And we have found the abundance of opportunities to work together, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years. Jeff, as I was listening to you tell your story, one of the things that popped from me that I just so appreciate about you and find examples of in every time we're in the room together, be it in person or in Zoom, it's been a lot of Zoom, is your resilience. that you greet the world with enthusiasm, curiosity, and trusting the possibilities. And so one of the things that was wonderful for me in partnering with Jeff is if I said to Jeff, "Hey, Jeff, I have an idea," he would say yes before I even said what the idea was. He's just so much about possibilities. And the other thing that Jeff and I share as values is that we really love and value community. And so whatever we do, be it in ICW or in our teaching together, it's about building the community and sharing the opportunities. So Jeff and I work together at ICW Consulting. We also have been working together in a graduate program that Jeff has been leading for 10 years.
Yeah, probably it's about 12 now. Yeah.
You want to say a few words about that?
Sure. It's been an interesting process, and I say interesting in a wonderful developmental way, leading. And if I continue to build on what Ilene was talking about, one of the things that's like a hallmark in our practice, and then also because we teach together a lot, is building a container for transparency, discovery, care, connection. And we use the word love a lot. All right. And so it's in our practice, and it's also in our teaching experiences. And we use the word teaching loosely because we're designing for facilitation. But, one of the things, some of our clients come from that space because of what they've experienced, and they want their teams to experience. So we're working with leaders. So some of our clients have definitely come from that space where we're invited in. ICW is invited in to work at usually top level to mid-level of system, and then helping people explore how they can be better connected, how they can be transparent to build relationships that lead to optimal results that include community. Because, as Ilene indicated before, multiple levels of system for us, lots of times people see it as tri, we see it as a quad. It's individual, group, institutional, organizational, and because a lot of the organizations that we work with the community for sure, inviting it in with the larger whole idea around what is community, even asking that question.
Well, you're asking my questions for me because the community is, a perfect jumping off point to say, I just love to, get into the weeds for a second. And we've, mentioned ICW a couple times, which stands for Innovative Communities at the Workplace. And I wondered if you could talk about where that name came from and what that means to both of you.
I think I'll start. I'll be candid, when we were launching the consulting firm, the branding person I worked with said, right now, Ilene Wasserman has brand, people know that brand. And I did not want to start a firm with my name. So I used the initials ICW. And over the years, Jeff came in pretty early into our work together. And over the years, Innovative Communities at the Workplace really said what we were about. We were about sparking creativity, sparking communities at work. And the I could also stand for inclusive, because at the fundamental part of what we're doing is creating cultures that are inclusive. And the C could stand for communication, because as we know, and you know all too well, Abby, how we create our worlds is in the exchanges and turns of meaning and sense making. And so while we are innovative communities at the workplace, we're innovative, inclusive communities communicating culture at the workplace.
ICCCW. I understand why you went, which is ICW.
I would say that was a big part of the attraction as we're thinking about exploring what does community mean. So one of the things that jumped for me, especially as we were talking, was invitation. What is the language of invitation that we're creating for these inclusive communities of practice, really, if we think about it? And then innovation also speaks to the whole idea of what are you sparking and encouraging where people can bring their full voice, their full skills, and their talents to thinking together to co-create the communities that they want, that will be most valuable. And co-creation is right at the center of everything that we do. And that whole idea of cultivating cultures.
Yeah.
And for us that have impact, we've been in situations where especially as we're thinking about the pandemic, we recognize, we were in Zoom meetings, everything else. It wasn't supposed to be that way, but we're in Zoom meetings and we have to shift and learn a little differently. But we found out that the core of what we do translates even in this space by the power of the types of questions that we're asking, our commitment to model transparency, opportunity to disclose when it's appropriate to model that as far as like our own practice, as far as leadership is concerned. And the feedback that we've received is that made a big difference managing the tension people were feeling. And as they were working 18, 19-hour days to make things happen during that time.
I just want to pick up one thing that you said, Jeff. What does it mean to you to spark community?
Yeah, I want to share this story. I'll share this story.
Please.
One, is showing up fully in myself, believing that I have a contribution. So that's exactly what I was saying before, kind of like modeling in that space the possibilities of what it could be. And this is over years, like early in my work career, where people would say, oh, you see with rose-colored glasses, the world can't be like that. And I would always fight against that tide. And try to show up the way I wanted the world to be. And I remember, in particular, a couple of people that I reported to. One was the president. They had two separate roles, and a CEO. But they used to call me the organizational priest, because I would say things, I think ways that it could be accepted, even if it was uncomfortable. And then even if I was out for a little bit, the way I would say things, I would get reinvited back in. Mm-hmm. Which was important, really important, because I learned how to do that. I think I learned that from my dad. That's the way my dad approached life, that he wanted to stay in relationship as much as possible. And I believe that's a possibility. Even in this fractured, polarized world that we have now, the higher ed spaces that we operate in right now, the system we operate is a system that is, quote, a progressive system in one part of the country, and then we're another part of the country that's more conservative. Yet we're invited in. Because of the way we're trying to show up. Eileen, what would you add to that?
I definitely think that there's a lot to be said for modeling the relationships, the culture, the community that you want to create. When Jeff and I, there's a couple of stories that come to mind. One is just what we create in a client when we bring them all together, and we spend time seeding the invitation for people to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And then we invite them into a space where we ask, What is it you'd like to know? What is it you'd like to share? And the structure of that space, which you know is very important, is 2 concentric circles, where the inner circle, it's called the fishbowl, where people are having a conversation. And they come in and out of that inner space, focusing on the question. So recently, one of our clients was at a meeting at the Chamber of Commerce, and they were talking about the brave space conversations they were having. That was a ripple from some work that we had done with them. There were a couple of CEOs in the room, and they said, "Oh, let's do that." And it was a perfect example of somebody taking a tactic that evolved from a lot of intentional relationship building and safe space building. And our client said, in my experience, you can't just put the chairs in a circle. There's a lot of seating that you need to do before you get there. And so that's one of those things that when people would be in those conversations and they'd say, how did we get here? This is amazing. We always have to help them remember how they got there, that they didn't just show up in that circle. So that's one example. The other example that comes to mind is in the earlier days of the work Jeff and I were doing together, I made a suggestion to our parent organization, the OD network. They were floundering a little bit. And I said, you know what? We have to remember our roots and imagine our future. And they said, great idea. Why don't you lead that process at our next conference? And I called Jeff. I said, I'm not doing this unless you do this with me. If you've ever seen this activity, it's a timeline activity where you remember important moments from the past into the future in episodic timeframes. And you look at them from different levels of context: personal, relational, professional, and the larger world community. And the process enables people to be part of the same history. I may not have been there then. I may not have remembered that particular moment. But after we've spent these hours together, looking at this timeline activity together, we are part of a shared history. And I see those 2 stories as examples of things that I could do in partnership that I could never do alone.
Yeah. I really like the language of sparking community because it's bringing to mind an image of like a campfire. And it just, as I keep thinking through it, as you're both talking, that feels right, that a community is this kind of living, breathing, moving thing that can be started or ignited or, brought to life through a small spark that becomes a flame, that becomes the fire. And that's what I hear in the stories that you both just shared, is that it was these smaller moments over time that was what you saw had the potential to spark a community, which you saw as this living, breathing thing that was possible.
That is all for part 1 of our conversation with Ilene and Jeff, but you can join us next Monday for part 2, where we will continue this conversation about community and Ilene and Jeff's amazing work, their experiences, their ideas, thoughts, feelings. I feel like there's a lot of insight to be gained from speaking with Ilene and Jeff. I thought that when we recorded this conversation and now being able to listen back to it and getting to share it, I definitely feel like this is a very fruitful conversation. So I'm glad that you chose to be a part of it. Thank you for joining us today. As we know, the conversation doesn't have to end right when this podcast episode ends. So keep playing around with the things that Ilene and Jeff talked about today. decide what they mean for you. Keep thinking about those questions that I posed at the top of the episode, and join us for part 2 next week. As always, I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. I am supported in so many ways from them, and I'm so thankful to be able to collaborate with them on this project and be a part of all of the other wonderful projects that they do to be creating better social worlds. A huge thank you to the CMM Institute, and especially a huge thank you to Rick Spann, who creates our music for the episode. I hope you can pay attention to that as you listen to future episodes and find some meaning in the music as well. Maybe that can add a layer of meaning for you. Finally, some great podcast next turns of what we can do from here is if you can follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating, leave a review, share an episode, or connect with me. All of those are amazing things to keep the conversation going, to help invite more people into the conversation, and to spark new ideas. And like we talked about today, spark community, I hope. So in terms of reaching out to me, you can reach out to me on Instagram at Stories Lived, Stories Told Pod. You can find me on YouTube and leave a comment at Stories Lived, Stories Told, or you can contact me on the website, storieslivedstoriestold.com. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.